right, welcome back, everybody. Welcome to episode 9 of Error Correcting Erik, where, of course, every week we go through a chapter of David Deutsch, Beginning of Infinity. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about chapter 9, which is Optimism. And it's last chapter we talked about infinity, which was more technical, it was more mathematical, it was a bit more abstract. Now we're going to talk about optimism, which has more practical applications,
Indeed.
a bit of more philosophical thought. And I would like to start with page 212 because he has written something in bold.
Okay.
So it is probably important. Yeah.
Is it the only bold in the entire book, do you think? Or
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I've seen it before. I've also seen some things in a frame.
Oh, yeah?
So
Okay.
they might be more important than the other ones. So because everybody has heard about optimism before, and the classical example is an optimist sees a half glass and will say it's half,
Right.
it's half full, and then a pessimist will say it's half empty.
Yes.
But that's not what Deutsch means with optimism. For him, that's not a philosophical debate, it's more a psychological thing.
Indeed.
So let's start with what he sees as his view on the principle of optimism. And this is what is written in bold, actually. So the principle of optimism, according to David Deutsch, page 212, is all evils are caused by insufficient knowledge. So that's his principle of optimism. Yeah. So let's start from there.
Yeah. Wow, so much things that come to mind now, but yeah, let's tackle them as they come up in my head, I guess, or discuss them better. So I remember the first time I read that all evils are due to a lack of insufficient or a lack of knowledge or insufficient knowledge. I was like, wait, I'm sure I can find an example.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm sure I'll find something. And like I've heard many podcasts and many other people that try to attack this principle of all kind of all angles. But I've every time I've come to the conclusion that it is correct as a principle because if it is not prohibited by the laws of nature, as we've seen before, or the laws of physics, it is possible given the right knowledge.
Exactly. Yeah.
So optimism as well is more, problems are inevitable, and then the optimistic part is problems are soluble, but given the right knowledge, soluble, which also has to do with infinity because problems are infinite and solutions are infinite. So when he talks about and what you mentioned, the psychological traits that have to do with, seeing a glass half full or empty, or with whiskey, is that it basically kind of rides on the notion of the principle of mediocrity, for example, where like Dawkins speaks about this, where he says, because he's an evolutionary, biologist, that he sees, as you said in the last episode, he sees things through that lens. So he sees things evolving, and he says he doesn't see why our brains would have evolved to understand the highly complex or the highly the very big and the very tiny, in whatever shape or form. But then the obvious rebuttal there is, well, it wasn't obvious for us to understand quantum mechanics. It wasn't obvious for us to understand relativity theory. Like that is not an evolutionary trait. To which then the critics will say, yeah, we just got lucky. For example, and we should kind of count our blessings that we've been so lucky, but we should not expect this luck to continue. That's basically the broad strokes of scientific pessimism. That everything's been discovered. There are new discoveries, and I remember they once like praised Newton for they said you could only discover the mechanics of the universe once or something. And Newton was that lucky bastard that got it, but after that, no more science, right? And I think that's an important. It took me a while as well because as we grow up in school, we often are taught all these great things, but then the next question is, so what's new? Like you and I think is one of the reasons why we're doing this right now is because we also equally were like, but there must be other unsolved new foundationally groundbreaking things. So, but it didn't seem to be there. It kind of stagnated almost in a sense. And then that's how I kind of came to Deutsch from that perspective. So to wrap that part up, I think it has a lot to do with seeing problems as being soluble, seeing that the principle of mediocrity is a bad principle because it is inconsistent. Because if you approach optimism from like a fool's optimism type of way, then you still run into, not solving objective problems because you just expect progress to happen by itself.
Exactly.
Which it doesn't. It needs people, it needs humans to go out there and change things. Like what's the law again of the semiconductor, where
Moore's law?
Yeah, Moore's law, for example. Like it's coined a law, but it's not really a law, right? It's just there was a trend of speed and time being passed. It's not a law of physics. It just got coined this way. And equally, I was confused when I read about that law because I was like, but why does that need to continue? And can it even continue at infinite, right?
For those who don't know, so Moore's law was at a certain point that computers were getting faster and faster. They said I think the speed or the amount of transistors or something will like double every, I don't know, year or every 10 years or something like that. Given a certain surface or whatever, but of course, nowadays that's not really it's not a law that has infinite progress.
I mean, it's just not a law, I think, in its actual sense, right? But to me, the profoundness there was because it almost like gives progress to to non-human behavior. If you just say, oh, semiconductor or whatever chips or computing power is just going to by itself get faster and faster because that's the trend we saw over the last 30 years, so we're extrapolating that to the future. That is a fool's optimism.
True.
Because then you would just say, let's stop investments into that industry, and somehow that magically continues, which it doesn't. And the pessimistic one is equally foolish, but pessimistically foolish. But they both come at from a different angle, but they're both equally not consistent. Because the pessimist will say, let's stop progress because progress is dangerous because we'll have weapons of mass destruction. We have atomic weapons. We have biological weapons, guns or whatever. So it's always like, but what if the bad guy gets a hold of that technology, artificial intelligence with ChatGPT, the same thing, right? Where people were going signing petitions to stop the investment into what is now AI in its like large language model structure. So equally so, like. No, because technology has always been dangerous. The first fork that was invented, could be dangerous. The first fire, I think David Deutsch uses the example of fire. The first, culture to invent fire, you probably didn't survive because they invented it and then they burned themselves to death. So that culture literally died. Because they didn't know how to properly use the fire. But then the fire was a catalyst still for other, for the cultures that did get the knowledge to maintain the fire in a way that helps them and solves their problems.
Cooking food and then pottery, brick firing, the melting of metal, stuff like that.
The counter for progress and like bad guys using that progress or using that technology is more progress because you will never be able to stop the bad guy then from using that weapon. So in this hypothetical doomed situation, so what you need to do is you need to create even more progress in your society so you're always ahead of the quote unquote bad actor. In that case.
There are a couple of things there, but first let's clarify a bit what he means with his bold sentence. Literally printed in bold. He says that all evil. He says it can be two things. It can be natural disaster. Let's say as of the time that we're recording this, we've had a massive flood, for example, in Spain. A couple of years ago, we had one in the south of Belgium and France. It was a big disaster. Many people lost their homes. They lost everything. It's a natural disaster. And he describes that as well as an evil that potentially could be prevented. If we had more knowledge on maybe how water flows or where it flows, on the amount of volume, on how to deal with large floods, a better sewer system, delta works, I don't know. Those things could have been prevented. So we can prevent floods in the future with more knowledge.
Right.
So natural disaster is one aspect that he means with evil. Because we could always say, oh, you know, there could things could happen to us that we don't have an impact. An asteroid could fall.
Non-human. Created.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but not necessarily, because you know if we know that an asteroid is coming years in advance, we could work towards that. You know,
Exactly.
we could send a probe and nudge it out of the way, or we could blow it up, or whatever, or
Right.
make some kind of shield. I don't know.
Which we can already.
Yeah, or even move the Earth out of a bit out of the sun's orbit. I don't know. So there is, even though we don't have the knowledge now, you know, we could generate the knowledge in the future
Right.
to prevent like non-human induced evil like natural disaster.
Right.
You know, you could argue that some floods are caused by climate change and so on, but yeah,
But still, then
Yeah,
you
but
would
still
you would
then-
still want the knowledge
exactly
to be able, and we have that knowledge, by the way. You said, you know, the floods and all. There's a really cool country as an example.
Dutch.
The Dutch. They're
yeah.
literally underneath the sea level, yet they don't seem to have the floods going on,
Yeah.
right? Because they do have knowledge, and they have created, you know, infrastructure, and they've done these investments and research, and they've literally created the knowledge to prevent those things from happening.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one aspect. Let's call it natural disaster in one way, but the other way, he also says like human-induced evil, like for example the Second World War.
Right.
Even that, with the right knowledge or different view on diplomatic relationships or a better understanding of fascism or the bad sides of communism. You know, I believe around 50 million people died in the Second World War. That also could have been prevented with knowledge. And so it's two aspects: as the human-induced evils or accidents, and then we have the natural disasters.
Right.
So that's one part to better understand the sentence. And then there's more the philosophical part that you described of optimism and pessimism. And
Psychological, you mean?
yeah. And in the book, he describes that both sides can be too much. I'm not sure how he calls it. You can be overly optimistic, and he gives the example of the Titanic. So they were so optimistic that it's never going to sink, it's never going to break. So they were reckless, and they hit an iceberg, and it sank.
Yeah.
So if you are overly optimistic, that could lead to recklessness.
Right.
And if you're overly pessimistic, that could lead to a complete halt.
Right.
And he gives some examples of historical examples of in the past. He talks, for example, of the city of Florence, I think in the 1400s, that had a surge of culture and art and psychology and science and so on.
Yeah.
And then there was a priest who came into power, and he completely shut it down because he wanted to go back
the
to the
Medici
old...
or something.
Yeah. We had the Medici family or something who was in power, and just as the ancient Greeks in Athens, they put a lot of effort in culture and science and so on, and democracy, and they flourished. And there were people who were halting. He gives the example that Sparta was like the opposite of Athens, because they didn't have any culture, science. The only thing that they had were soldiers and warfare.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's it. And there was no. You could argue that there is maybe some progress in military tactics or equipment, but that's like the only thing they had.
Sure.
It's the only thing they were good at.
It wasn't like Athens, right?
Exactly. Athens had a wide scope, exploration,
philosophy.
Yes, and that's where the term we still use today, the Spartan regime, the disciplinary military aspect. It's the only thing they knew. It was conquest.
Right.
But anyhow, so in history, you've had these surges in thoughts of exploration and progress. And then you had thoughts, psychological or philosophical thoughts, on halting that. So that's one thing he describes. And then there is another school of thought, that's what you said about Newton, that he describes in the book, that there are people that believe that we've reached the limit. And that doesn't only apply, in my opinion, to science, but also we see that around us in our daily life. we have friends that believe that we have reached some limit in society on our planet, that we can no longer progress, that we are living in some apocalyptic,
Right.
capitalistic, and that we're completely going to destroy our planet. It's going to run out of resources,
Right.
and in 50 years we're all going to die. So
Yeah.
they don't even bother with,
Yeah.
with having kids anymore.
Right.
And we were discussing that throughout history there have been people with a pessimistic view that the world is going to end or progress is going to end. We're going to run out of resources.
Prophecies.
Yeah, prophecies of doomsday, but not only religious doomsday prophecies.
Scientific
also
ones as well.
scientific ones
Yeah.
as well. So in the 1800s, there was already a scientist who believed that all the laws of physics were invented. We're not going to invent anything new.
Yeah.
Thus, we were probably not going to have a lot of technological innovations, no advancement. There was a calculation done that we were going to run out of food 200 years ago.
Malthus. I
Yes,
think. Yeah.
because he calculated the growth of the population,
Yeah.
but he didn't foresee the creation of knowledge
Yeah.
that would allow to get more food or to work in a more efficient way.
Exactly.
So, and that is typically a pitfall of all the prophecies and the doom thinking, that they don't account for the growth of knowledge,
Exactly.
and that they don't account for the innovation in technology and progress to solve our problems, which we've said so many times by reading the book. Problems are soluble.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people who believe that today, that the earth is going to run out of resources and so on. It's going to run out of oil or whatever, and it's going to run out of food or energy, or we can only do that by completely destroying the world. And we are like the last generation, and nothing really matters, and we shouldn't even have kids because
Yeah.
the earth is a dark place. People are being exploded, climate change, and this.
Yeah, people are parasites
Yes.
of this planet, and
Exactly.
it's better that the planet will be better off without us. Type
Yeah.
of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can think whatever you want to think,
Yeah.
but those people don't really take into account the creation of knowledge. It's the same problem. So even if we are facing problems now with climate change and energy crisis and so on, and floods and so on, according to the philosophy of David Deutsch, all problems are soluble.
Right.
And even if we create new problems, we will solve them as well. So
Right.
now, as you said, with AI, people are scared that large language model AIs are going to turn into the Terminator, and they're going to
Yeah.
take over the world. They're going to take over all our jobs.
Yeah.
No, they're just going to create new problems that we can work on, new problems to solve,
Right.
and we can continue with that.
Right. Well, problems are unique to conscious entities as well.
Uh-huh.
Like we have, we have actual problems that are like we have moral problems as well.
Yeah.
A dog doesn't have moral problems, for example.
yeah.
It has problems like when to eat and all these things, but it doesn't have the same problems that we do. And this as you said, like I think one of the quotes is that prophecy is biased towards pessimism.
Yeah.
And I think I don't know if it's discussed in the book, but my intuition is that it has to do with our biological history.
Mhm.
That whenever you touch a stove and it's hot, you're going to remember that stove being hot, and you're not going to want to touch it again.
Mhm.
So we are wired to avoid pain.
Yeah.
Because there was an evolutionary kind of trait, right,
Yeah,
to
exactly.
avoiding pain for survival, kind of in its more raw sense, right? Survival attributes or things that would be beneficial to that organism or the species.
Yeah.
So I think we kind of take that psychologically as well. We are very prone to think negatively about things.
Mhm.
And I think it's our biological
Nature,
Yeah.
wiring,
Wiring.
yeah,
but our rational wiring can override that, right? And we see this again and again and again. Every prophecy by every religion, by
Yeah.
the Mayans, the
yeah.
the Athenians, the whoever, like every single prophecy has literally never come true.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's always like, oh yeah, but it's not now, or they have to change the timeline, or
Yeah.
they have to do some little tinkering, or they say, oh, not because of this. So
Yeah.
optimism is that principle where all those problems are soluble, and the growth of knowledge is the only way to solve those problems.
Mm-hmm.
Because let's face it, climate change was here before humans were here.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we are the cause of it, stopping progress in a lot of these ESG initiatives, right? These very climate net zero initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
often actually have the opposite effect of what they're trying to achieve. They often stifle progress because they tax things, right? So you tax oil very high, you tax cheap energy, you tax them very high, and then you kind of reinvest that through the taxation scheme into what is deemed climate neutral technologies, for example. But I'd argue you never had to coerce TV manufacturers into making their TVs more energy efficient, right? The free market takes care of those
They
things.
did it by themselves.
Yeah, because of economies of scales, because of the capitalistic societies, they want to drive profits, they want to drive efficiencies. The same thing goes for a lot of things. I think this is a future chapter or future more philosophical discussions, and we're getting into like also memetics, like rational and anti-rational memes. In future chapters this will come up. But back to the pessimism sometimes baked into people being, first of all, like humans hating themselves is a weird phenomenon. No other animal I think hates itself, and no other animal is racist towards itself. We are literally racist towards ourselves as a human species. Somehow we are parasites or blah blah blah, or the earth is better off without us. This type of thing, but we are the only species at the same time supposedly responsible for all ill doings, right? But at the same time, we're also the ones that are keeping species alive, like the pandas, that actually, without our intervention, would go extinct. Extinction events have been happening ever since there was life.
Yeah, like 99% of all species are already extinct,
exactly.
And humans had nothing to do with it.
Exactly. So this weird notion that we are like, any other animal taking care of itself is deemed natural. But when we do it, is deemed unnatural. And I found that, and I was also kind of previously, you're with the hype, right? You're with this thing, and you hear all the doomsdays and the climate rising and everything. But then you see people, throwing cans of soup against Mona Lisas nowadays. And I don't want to have too much, let's say, current events in our podcast, because I'd like this to be able to withstand the notions of time. But for the future watching, there was a time where people were throwing soup cans against the Mona Lisa because of climate change, for context. But so it goes again into that pessimism. It goes again into the wiring of our biological nature. And those people, I'm sure they legitimately believe these things. I believe that they believe this. I believe they think they are doing the right thing.
Otherwise they wouldn't do it.
Right. I mean, you could say some people know better and maybe are
group pressure or whatever.
Or jumping onto
the rebel or whatever.
Or the money train, because it's profitable now to be pro climate or something. So there's
get
these
elected
things.
As a politician, whatever.
Exactly. But apart from that, a lot of pessimism, like children. People don't, as you said, don't want to have children, which is an odd thing, because, like me being a recent father, it is truly one of the most amazing things that you can do. It's astonishing, and that's a whole other conversation. But as you said, this pessimism is well spread through people's psychological being, beyond just this type of climate pessimism, but there's this kind of parasitic pessimism about ourselves. And Malthus has this, was it like the color TVs where you have cobalt, and they calculated we have this amount of cobalt in the planet, calculate that with the amount of color TVs being produced, so the color TVs will end that year. And we'll all go back to black and white. That's what people thought, because you extrapolated. But it doesn't take into consideration the growth of knowledge. Then LCD TVs came, because we had new problems to solve. So natural resources as well are only resources if you have the knowledge to convert them into energy. And I think Deutsch, for example, well, this goes into the dinosaurs, but I think we talked about that already. But so, for example, this glass of water has in principle enough energy to power like a small city, right? If we would only be able to unlock cold fusion, right? so in principle, but we don't have the knowledge. And I don't know if cold fusion is against the laws of nature. Somebody fact check me on that. I'm not sure if we even know if it is or not. But in principle, the amount of energy between the bonds of these water molecules is large enough to be powered through a nuclear type fusion or fission process, where it would unleash enough energy to power a small city for a year.
Yeah.
Right? So that is there. We just don't have the knowledge yet to convert it.
Yeah, exactly.
And the same goes for oil. The same goes for anything. But meanwhile, what's happening is because of a lot of these ESG initiatives, the taxes are going higher on cheap energy. And we in the West, we are more wealthy, so we have, I think, more ability or more knowledge to curb those taxes. But then you have a lot of regions in the world where they rely on cheap energy for their heating, for their food. A lot of things are made of plastic, and plastic is made through energy as well. So people often don't realize, I think, that there's a vast amount of what we would consider third world countries that rely on cheap energy, natural gases, oil, the crude oil type, energies that we have sworn off from our society. I'd say wrongly so. That's my I think a lot of people's opinion now, more and more, that the climate change misrepresentation has been very vast, because a lot of these doomed scientists out there have been prophesying the end of the day, and there's been movies, right, about this. And one year it was going to be a global cooling, right? Remember?
Yeah.
And then
the day after tomorrow or something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we went through a phase where scientists said there's going to be a next ice age. Yeah. And then all of a sudden temperatures kept going up, and people were like, "Hey, what's up here, guys?" And then so no, it's going to be a global warming now. And then this, like, I'm not a climate scientist, but I've listened to a lot of people that should know about this, and they all say, depending on the variables and the models you use, things go differently. Yeah. We just don't have enough ability to predict that yet. Yeah. So let's not put people in a situation where they cannot afford their energy, right? And literally die. Yeah. Because of not having access to cheap energy to warm their houses.
Yeah. I think this boils down to like the philosophical or psychological reasoning about two sides, and it boils down to being optimistic or pessimistic. Those are you have those people who believe that we need to stop what we're doing now and completely switch back or revert or do something else. Let's call them the pessimist way of thinking. Yeah. And we have people who say we cannot halt progress, we need to continue, and we will find a solution for these problems. Yeah. And once we stop discussing them, investing them, once we're gonna run schemes to shift them around, we're only gonna like move the problem or make it worse or whatever.
Yeah, that's like the spaceship Earth metaphor that's often given to Earth, right? It's like Earth is a special place, and we are very lucky that we have the Earth in this special situation, attuned for our very needs. Yeah. But look, we are now in Antwerp, Belgium. It's winter now. Yeah. Without the technology of central heating,
we would freeze to death,
and we would not be able to survive here, right? So
exactly.
So this region is not particularly friendly to life. Even the sub-Saharan African continent, where we all evolved from, it was still not very friendly to us. Like lions were chasing us, diseases were trying to kill us. Yeah. Like nothing was ever as comfortable as today. Yeah. Yeah. Given all the knowledge that we've created to be able to sustain going from like a bunch of, was it like 10,000-20,000 hunter-gatherers that we were, to what, 6 billion now, or I forget the number of us?
I think it's, could be, maybe double, I don't know.
Yeah, so it's the amount of people now that we can sustain, because we have the knowledge and the resources to do that, is just crazy. It is truly a testament to human ingenuity and our ability to create knowledge. So coming back to the point of wait, where was I again? I lost my chain of thought.
The ability to sustain ourselves.
Right. But before that,
Rely on cheap energy.
cheap energy. Yeah. Anyway, oh yeah. So the spaceship Earth metaphor. So if you look at society, like every other culture that died in history, wasn't able to solve its problems.
Yeah.
Because otherwise they would still be here.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have like this Easter Island, and I know that what's this nature documentary guy, Attenborough.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, David Attenborough. He's a very also climate activist kind
exactly.
of type thing, and on the Oscars he was talking about this often.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So he goes to the Easter Islands and he says, "Wow, things were so pristine here. Like there was a time where the people here were living like in perfect harmony with nature, and they they consumed what they needed, and they had this thing." And then the logical question is, well, where are they now?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
If they were so well off and they had everything they needed, why aren't they here now?
Yeah. Well, you could sustain that for a certain amount of time.
Yeah. Until something happens.
That
you don't have the knowledge.
Exactly.
To solve that problem. So one bad winter needs to come.
Yeah, exactly.
Destroy your crops.
Yeah.
And if you don't have the knowledge to maybe harvest in the winter.
Yeah.
Because you've never needed to do that because your society was just built in a way where you had traditions, right? And also those Easter egg heads, apparently. Apparently, I'm probably not entirely accurately saying this, but they had this tradition of making these heads just for the sake of making them.
Yeah.
And they would just have like these heads. So whenever things got rough or something, they created more of these heads for the gods or something. Yeah. So you had this whole island full of these heads, but probably by the end of their days when they were dying, they were still making these heads rather than investing into solving the problems that actually need solving, because they didn't believe that they could, maybe because they had more godlike societies.
Exactly. And that's an important part, because the idea of us finding like some sort of equilibrium where we live in harmony with nature, I think it would entail that there would be no growth for humans anymore, like global population.
Right. There's a max.
There would be a max.
Yeah.
And it doesn't account for unpredictable, unforeseen problems in the future, because if you halt progress, the growth of knowledge, then what are we going to do when a supervolcano erupts, or when we figure out that there is a meteor on a collision with Earth?
Exactly.
So it's
and all those nice pandas, all those dolphins that we all care about,
they're all gone.
They're all gone.
Yeah.
Like it takes one large meteorite to really mess things up for everybody here. And I don't see any other species trying to build rockets to deflect those things, right? So, again, I think this comes back to the difference between what humans are and other entities, which is not a quantitative difference in intelligence, but there's a qualitative difference because we are universal explainers, and that's what separates us from other animals.
Yeah, exactly. Well, coming back to the natural resource thing, there was one quote that's been floating around, especially because we're talking about oil, and it says, "Oh, we're gonna run out of oil very soon."
Right.
Yeah, that's one thing. Well, first of all, that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
If we look at the latest numbers, and I got this from our own from our Belgian from the VRT. So this is our national broadcast. Are they the best credible source? I don't know, but if they say it, you can assume they've put in enough thought. According to them, we can keep producing oil worldwide as we're doing it now until at least 2050. So first of all, we're gonna have oil we're gonna be able to produce the same amount of oil until 2050. And then even if
that's based on the reserves that we know where they are. Yeah, we don't even know if there's other reserves.
Exactly. That's just taking into account everything that we know today. Yeah. So if you don't change anything, we'll have oil until 2050.
Yeah.
And even then, if we would completely run out of oil, or it would be too expensive to harvest, and then it's probably that's not the end of the world. So the philosophy of David Deutsch dictates it's an optimistic philosophy. That because of the growth of knowledge, we will find other solutions. We will crack cold fusion, or we will do asteroid mining, where we take minerals from asteroids
Right.
and turn that into energy.
Yeah.
An important thing that he
Yeah.
also described is that we cannot predict the growth of knowledge.
Cannot.
But the idea that it's not gonna save us in the future, I think, is because it is completely wrong, because it always has.
It always has, but it doesn't necessarily need to.
Mm-hmm.
But it is possible.
Mhm.
But it's not necessarily so.
Exactly.
So our societies should be kind of governed in a way where we optimize for the growth of knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's later chapters is going to go into
Okay.
more like he's going to touch on like political
Yeah.
structures as well,
Mhm.
and how politics and democracy plays a role into the growth of knowledge.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, as you said, I think apart from the oil and whatever those estimates are, and
Yeah.
again changes and all these
Yeah.
things. Apart from that, we have nuclear energy, for example, that could fuel everything forever, but it has such a negative connotation because of a couple of disasters
Yeah.
of technology of nuclear reactors that were very old,
Yeah.
right? So now I think Bill Gates has been working on some of
Exactly.
these things, and
There-
now it's a lot safer,
Yeah.
less.
There's a really interesting there's really interesting documentary on the life of Bill Gates
Yeah.
on Netflix, I believe, and he goes through a couple of his projects, like his is it his Ebola vaccination program,
Right.
then some new sanitation system,
Yeah.
and a new modern nuclear reactor
Yeah.
that, if I understood it correctly, actually runs on the nuclear waste of old reactors.
Right.
So you actually already solved that waste problem, and that doesn't have the risk of the disasters that old, because most nuclear reactors that we have today are built from concept of the 70s and the 80s.
Exactly.
And the big problem is a meltdown. It's a meltdown risk. You need to actively cool them all the time, or else they will overheat and you will have a natural disaster. So, but the new nuclear reactor doesn't run the risk of overheating. If a natural disaster would occur, it would just
Shut down. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
It wouldn't. There's no active cooling required. So that problem
Has been solved.
has been solved. It hasn't been built yet,
Yeah.
but that problem has been solved.
Yeah.
So, and that is just taking into account nuclear energy, but
Right.
because of disasters and stuff. Because what you said, there is the biological bias, but I also believe a large part is the media bias. We have our daily lives, and then we see the big disasters on TV or whatever, like, oh my God, how can we continue like this, and we need to stop with nuclear power because of this. But we don't think about, and that's what you said, the good that it brings us every single day.
Right.
We're very comfortable here in this home, in a heated, insulated house. We
Yeah.
don't think, we take it for granted.
Yeah.
And I think that's also where the pessimistic thinking or philosophy or way of thinking comes from for a lot of people.
Right.
They don't think about the positive things.
Yeah. And my intuition is that pessimism comes from our biological
Yeah.
ancestry
Mhm.
that we always carry with ourselves.
Yeah.
And that kind of then extrapolates into media, because media is people, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I think it's just maybe an incentive structure that has more prone to sensationalism and
Yeah, absolutely.
all these things that we're also wired to
Yeah.
kind of
If you look at the
give attention
research,
to.
there are a couple of fields that trigger the most emotional
Yeah.
response, and it's stuff like nostalgia,
Right.
and it is negative stuff. So if you, as a media company, write or report on negative stuff, more people will watch it, and you will
Right.
have higher profits. So and that could relate back to the biological bias
Yeah.
that you described,
Yeah.
and that's why these things happen.
Yeah. But yeah, more nuclear plants would be an immediate kind of solving of all of the so-called climate change activists that for some magical reason don't want what is best, because again it's a very paradoxical thing, right?
Yeah.
Because we have technology, but you don't want to deploy it for other irrational reasons. But then you have like windmills that are very like inefficient apparently as well, and now you have was it like Trump who said on one of the podcasts with Joe Rogan is that apparently a lot of whales get attracted to the sounds of the windmills, and they actually die because they get too close. So
Okay.
windmills are apparently killing whales, that because of the again the sounds it makes, it
Okay.
maybe like
Like
attracts
the
them.
offshore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The ones that are in the waters, and they
Mhm.
attract the whales, and so like literally, apparently, whales are dying because of windmills.
Mhm.
I mean, how many birds die because of these windmills as well? It's insane.
Mhm.
The amount of like animals that are killed for these so-called green, energies, but then you don't hear Gaia or Greenpeace talking about these things.
Yeah.
They always go and attack the salmon fishers with their and they go spray them and
Yeah.
stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they catch the one odd dolphin,
Yeah.
with all their nets.
I understand what
Yeah.
you mean. Yeah.
Meanwhile the windmills are killing more
Yeah.
of these things. I mean, I don't know the numbers, right? So don't again,
Mhm. Yeah.
I'm just speaking kind of.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even know if it's necessarily true because we've heard the killing birds argument and and it's true, it's not true, and we can have endless discussions about that. And if we've learned anything, is that people don't really look at the data; they just look at what they believe. So even if the data would prove that the bird thing is true or the whale thing is true, people still wouldn't really care because it doesn't adhere to their belief.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think we can have endless discussions about that and oil and nuclear power, but,
Right.
but that's not the point, I think. It's not the point that David Deutsch is making in a book. I believe that his point is that his train of thought is an optimistic one. And that even if with all the problems that we have today, oil, climate change, floods, and the energy crisis and the financial crisis,
Right.
all of those things, or conflicts, those are all soluble problems.
Yeah.
As long as I believe as we acknowledge that and we work towards it, if we would adopt, like a medieval view of
Yeah.
stopping progress and going back to previous things, I think then we're very much screwed.
Right. And yeah, it could very well be that way, right? I mean, every other culture that has ever existed doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
So we are very unique,
Yeah.
but we don't necessarily have to keep existing. There's no law of physics that says
Mm-hmm.
progress will continue.
Yeah, exactly.
The laws of physics just say that it can
Yeah.
continue.
Yeah.
And it's our responsibility to be a part of that progress. And I think Popper says we have a responsibility to be optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
A
Yeah.
duty, he says, I think. He uses the word duty. We have a duty to be optimistic.
Mm-hmm.
It is imperative that we all carry the torch of and again, not foolish optimism,
Yeah, exactly.
but Deutschian optimism.
Not the Titanic optimism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The optimism in the sense that problems are soluble,
Yeah.
given the right knowledge.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Before we wrap up this chapter, any other important things? Because I got all of the things that I wanted to say. Any other topics that you want to discuss?
No, I think the Popper quote wraps up quite nicely for me.
Cool.
So.
All right. Then I want to thank everybody again for tuning in. And next time we're going to continue with Erik correcting Erik. It's going to be chapter 10. Not sure what it's about.
Well, let's have a little.
We'll have to look it up
sneak
really
peek
quickly.
Here. Chapter 10 is A Dream of Socrates.
Okay, very curious. I'm going to be reading that the coming next weeks, and then that will be the topic of our next discussion. Thanks,
Awesome.
everybody. See you later.
Thank you.